Hey guys, today we're going to spend some time working in Onshape. Up until this point in Onshape, we have really only applied measurements to shapes, whether that be rectangles or lines or circles. Today we're going to add a little bit to that in the form of sketch constraints. Constraints are like rules that can be applied to individual shapes or lines in our sketch space. There's a lot of different constraints, and we're definitely not going to talk about all of them in this video, but hopefully this will give you a starting place where you can begin to define relationships between different lines in your sketch that will, at the end of the day, hopefully make things easier as you work with Onshape. So let's jump right into it and go back to where we've been up until this point. So I'm going to, in Onshape, create a new document, and I'm just going to call this my video about constraints. Okay, I am in my Part Studio. There's nothing in my feature menu other than the normal stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and make a sketch and just do a quick recap of the things that we've talked about up until this point. So at this point you should be able to know how to create a sketch in Onshape, how to get a sketch started. So let's just make a sketch on our front view here. And you should have a pretty decent feel for how to use most of these basic sketch tools. We're just using these tools up here in our menu to create basic shapes. So I'm just going to make a basic shape using two rectangles as an example. So we always want to start our shape on the origin, so I'm going to move my mouse over here and just move and create this rectangle. Now again, when you drop a shape in, you do have the option right after you click to place that shape to add some measurements. That's always a good practice. So let's say that I have a 2.5 inch width and a 3.25 inch height. Okay, so we've got this rectangle, and I'm going to press escape to get out of my rectangle tool there. I'll move my measurements out of the way. So you can see I have these two measurements. I'm going to go ahead and add another rectangle, and this is just a random shape, so I'm just making this up. Let's make it so that this rectangle has a width of 1 inch and it's got a height of 1.5 inches. So I'll go ahead and accept that sketch. And one thing that I want you to notice is, again, all of my measurements are fully constrained. I have no blue lines in my measurement. If I delete this measurement, you can see that this line is not defined anymore, and I can actually click and drag it to move it. When we are working in Onshape, we want everything to have a measurement. We want everything to have a definition in terms of its location and its geometry. So you can see that this is fully defined and everything works. You may have also noticed that as I moved my mouse across this shape, I get these little white boxes that come up that have all these little symbols in them. Those are actually sketch constraints. And if I click on Show Constraints in the Sketch menu, you can see behind the scenes all of these rules that got applied as I created this object. We've got a lot of different little rules that are applied here. But the one that I want to mention first is this one. It looks like a sideways T. This is the coincident constraint. And the coincident constraint is being applied to the two lines that are yellow on my screen right now. Coincident means that those two things are touching each other, or that their ends are touching. So you can see that this horizontal line here is coincident with this vertical line here. And you can see on all of my corner pieces I have a coincident constraint. I've also got a second coincident constraint here because this line, the endpoint of this line, is coincident with the origin. Okay, we've got some other constraints that are happening in here as well. This is the perpendicular symbol, so that means that this line is at a 90-degree angle to this line. We have what's called a horizontal constraint here. That means that this line is parallel with the x-axis, or that it's flat. It's on the same plane as the horizon, horizontal, right? Let's see, what else do we have here? We've got a parallel constraint. It says that the top and the bottom lines of this rectangular shape are parallel, so they are at the same angle with each other. I think that's all of the ones that we've got in this sketch. So we'll do more in a little bit, and we'll also talk about how we manually add constraints. But obviously, I did not add any of these constraints myself. As we work in Onshape, when we create shapes, it sometimes likes to guess what our constraints are. So as an example, if I take my line tool and I just move my mouse around, you can see that as I move my mouse over each of these lines, I get a constraint that shows up. So these are coincident constraints that are currently being displayed. So that means that I could start my line connected to one of these lines if that yellow line is highlighted and if I get that little box for the constraint. I also had another constraint that popped up right here, and I've got my line in this rectangle showing up in yellow, and I also have a little square that shows up. The gray box for this constraint is a midpoint constraint. So if I decided to start my line here, I would be placing it on the midpoint of this top line of this rectangle. I can get it over here as well, or over here, or down here. Now another thing I can get is I can get a vertical constraint, such as this one. If I move my mouse over here, that would mean that the start point of this line would be vertically aligned with the midpoint of that line above me. And if I come down a little bit more, you could see that just by hovering my mouse here, I could have 4 constraints added to this sketch without me having to go in and add them manually. This can be helpful, but what it means is that when we are working in Onshape, we have to be very careful to not accidentally add a constraint when we're working. So if I wanted to, for instance, add a line right here, but I didn't want to have any rules associated with it. You can see that because of where I placed this line, this has a horizontal constraint with the midpoint of this line. So when I try to move this point here at the end of this line, I can't move it up and down because it has a rule that says that it can't be anywhere that's not horizontally aligned with this point right here. So I'm moving my mouse up and down to try to move that line up and down, but it's not going anywhere. But if I go in here and I delete this constraint by clicking on it and pressing delete on my keyboard, now I can freely move this point. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so I'm going to click the green check on this sketch. So again, up until this point in this class, we've really only created sketches and extruded them. And we've really only lightly enforced having your object being dimensioned, particularly with our charm challenge, where we had more complicated shapes. Moving forward, that's not going to be a thing anymore. You'll be expected to have a fully dimensioned and fully constrained sketch. So, for this basic object, just as we've done before, I could extrude this thing. Let's say that I want it to be 1/8 of an inch. So there's my 3-dimensional object. It's just a really thin block, essentially. And we've got a lot of tools that we've used to modify shapes. So on this end, I will add a fillet, and let's make that fillet 1/64, just to keep it really small. But when I zoom in, you can see that that corner is rounded off. And on the other side, I'm going to add a chamfer, which is a lot like a fillet, but has a slightly different effect. So when I zoom in here, you can see that instead of having a rounded edge like the fillet on the other side, the chamfer it's like the corner gets cut off, right? So hopefully you fully understand everything that I just said, because that's essentially as far as we've gone up until this point. And some of you have really taken off and gotten pretty crazy with your design skills, but ideally everything that I just said makes sense to everybody. So I'm going to keep this part studio here. I'm going to create a new part studio. Don't forget to name your part studios. So I'm going to call this video part 1. Oops, that's not the right name at all. Video part 1, and I'm going to rename this one video part 2. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this part of the video is I'm actually going to play around with my sketch constraints. And to do that, I need to zoom my screen just a little bit. Okay, so now I have all of my constraints up here. If you don't see these constraints, if you don't see these tools, it's because you are not in sketch mode. So, friendly reminder, you won't be able to create a drawing unless you have sketch mode open. So make sure that you click on sketch and click on your work plane so that you can see those. If you've already made a sketch and you can't see them, it's because you closed that sketch bubble. So make sure you keep that sketch bubble open in Onshape so that way you can work in the appropriate space. Okay, so I'm going to make a shape here. It's just going to be a random shape. I'm going to just start it right here. And we're going to make this thing look as cursed as we possibly can. The important thing that I do want to make sure you know that I'm doing is that I'm making sure that there are no constraints being added to this shape. I don't want any constraints added to this shape at all. So I'm going to keep it just like that. This shape is pretty weird looking. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some constraints, which again, sketch constraints are rules that we can apply to the geometry of an object and its location. I'm going to use constraints to make this thing be fully defined. We'll add some measurements at the very end, but for now I want it to make it so that I can't click and drag any segment of this shape. So the first thing that I need to do is this isn't actually a closed shape. This point right here is not touching this point over here. I need to fix that. So to fix that, I'm going to come up into my constraint menu here, and we've got a lot of different constraints. But I'm going to use coincident. And if you hover over coincident, it will give you their description of that tool. It says it makes two or more sketch entities share the same location in a sketch. Translation, it makes it so that two things are touching each other. Okay, so I'm going to click on coincident. You can see that I'm using that tool because it's blue. I'm going to click on one point, and I'm going to click on the other. And you can see that they relocated, and so now both of those points are touching each other. I'm going to do that one more time. And I'm going to say out loud what I think when I do it. So I'm saying that this point, click, is coincident with this point, click. And you can see that that second point moved over to that first point. Now make sure that when you are done using a tool in Onshape that you close the tool. You can do that by either clicking on the tool in the menu or pressing escape. Okay, so now I have a closed shape, and I know that because I can hover my mouse over it and it selects, and it doesn't select, but it allows me to possibly select the whole shape. The other thing that we notice is that this shape is now a different color. It's now kind of filled in with that kind of milky gray color. Alright, so let's use some tools to make this thing look a little less weird. So I'm going to use my horizontal constraint and make it so that this bottom line is flat. I'm also going to go around and add some vertical constraints. Let's start on this side. So I'm going to apply a vertical constraint here and a vertical constraint here. Whoa boy, that got really confused. Let's try that again. Oh, that's because I meant to say horizontal constraint. Horizontal constraint. Okay, so we have a vertical constraint here, a horizontal constraint here. Let's put a vertical constraint on this line. And let's put a horizontal constraint on this line. Okay, so it's already starting to look a little bit more organized. And you may have noticed that I haven't done anything on this side. That's because I'm going to use a trick to make that simpler to deal with in just a moment. Alright. So, actually, I did not mean to put this horizontal constraint on. I'm going to delete this constraint. And you can delete constraints if you accidentally place a constraint on the wrong object. You just hover your mouse over that constraint. You can always view all of them right here. You can also hover over the object itself to see them. But I find that it's a little bit confusing. So if you're not sure, you can always hover over Show Constraints, click on that constraint, and press Delete. Okay, so this no longer has that horizontal constraint, and I know that because I can now click and drag it freely, and it can be at an angle, like you see here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and add the horizontal constraint to this one, not this one. Okay. Whoa, that got cursed. Okay, let's try that. So ultimately what I'm trying to build is some sort of a bracket that will be made out of metal. Okay, so we've got some relationships that we've built in on this side. Now, let's use what we've got over here and make it so that these ones on this other side match. And to do that, I'm going to use the parallel constraint. So up here in my menu, this is the parallel option. I want this line to be parallel with this line. And I'm going to try to drag this over a little bit to fix that a little bit. Just keeping things a little bit more clear here. Okay. And so now I want this line to be parallel with this line. And I want this one to be parallel with this one. Okay, so I want both of these lines to look the same, but I can't use a parallel constraint because they're not pointing the same direction. So what I can do instead is I can use a perpendicular constraint and make it so that this line is perpendicular with this line. So I'm just going to move these around. Maybe perpendicular is not what I want. Just kidding. We have some other things that we can do with that. We can actually use the constraints to make it so that the end points are at the same point, and then we can deal with that other part later. So let's use our horizontal constraint. So I want this point to be horizontal with this point, and I want this point to be horizontal with this point. So now at least the points are defined in the same place. Okay. So with just a couple of rules that we've applied, we've pretty easily made this to be a less weird looking object. Now it looks at least kind of like a realistic looking metal bracket, right? Okay, a couple more tricks. I'm going to come up into my menu here and I'm going to use my line tool. But then I'm also going to click one more time on this button. And this is not a tool that we've talked about heavily in this class yet, but we will. This is called the construction tool. And what this allows us to do is to create a shape in our sketch that is there for us as the designer, but is not actually part of the object itself. So I'm going to create some construction lines. And I want you to think of these as kind of reference lines that exist in the sketch for us to build some relationships between components in our sketch. So when we extrude this, the construction line won't exist in the extrusion. We won't be able to see it in the 3D model, but it will exist in the sketch. So I'm going to drop a construction line on the center of my 3D model here, and you can see that there. That's the construction line. It's kind of like a long line and a dot, long line and a dot. And I'm actually going to use a different constraint now. So the constraint that I'm going to use is the symmetric constraint. So I can use this to make it so that my lines are similar to each other. So I want this line to be symmetric with this line about the construction line here. I'm going to do that one more time. So I want this line and this line to be symmetric with each other about this construction line. I want this line and this line to be symmetric about the construction line. And that didn't change because they were already pretty similar. I want this and this to be symmetric about the construction line. And just like that, my shape is pretty well locked in. The only things that I haven't added more rules to are this top and bottom line. But now you can see if I move this line, the other side moves. If I move this line, the other side moves. If I move this line, the other side moves. Okay, let's add one more feature to this sketch. Let's add a circle. Let's put it right here. And let's make this circle, we are going to dimension this. Let's make this circle so that it has a diameter of 1/4 of an inch. Oops, 1/4 of an inch. Now, circles, just like any other shape or object in a sketch, need 3 things. Circles need their measurement, which in this case is their diameter. but they also need coordinates. So I'm going to define the distance, the location of this as being 0.5 inches from this far side. And then I'm also going to add 2 construction lines here. I'm going to add a construction line from top to bottom, and I'm going to add a construction line from the center to the bottom. So I have 2 lines here, one here and one here. And I'm going to use this as an opportunity to explain one other constraint. Up here in my menu I have a constraint called equal. And what this does is it makes it so that 2 things are the same size. So I'm going to make it so this line is equal in size to this line. And so now this circle is locked in the middle of this shape. Even if I change the size of this shape, because it doesn't have a dimension yet, the circle is always in the dead center. I could also use a midpoint constraint to create a constraint where this circle is locked in the middle as well. But I wanted to use an opportunity to show you the equal constraint. It's a very useful tool. Okay, so now I have a definition for where this thing is located in the y direction. I have a definition for where this thing is located in the x direction. And I have a diameter. But you can see my circle is still blue. And that's because we still haven't added measurements. So let's go ahead and do that. So the measurements that we are going to add to this shape. Oh, I forgot one very important thing. My shape is not on the origin. So we need to fix that. So I'm going to add a coincident constraint and make it so that my entire shape is on the origin. And obviously that broke a little bit. We can fix that in just 1 second. We just need to drag this up, drag this up. Oh boy. We have a constraint that got added. We have a horizontal constraint right here, so let's get rid of that. We seem to have some other, oh yeah, there's another horizontal constraint over here. Okay, now I can drag it back up and try to recreate my shape. Let's see if we can get it close to where it was. So that's where you got to watch out, because sometimes we get constraints that get added and we don't mean to add them. So it makes things tricky. So just be cautious when you're working. Alright, let's go ahead and stick with just about that size. That looks right to me. So let's go ahead and add some measurements. Let's make it so that this bracket overall is 3 inches. Let's make it so that this top dimension here is, let's make that 3/4 of an inch. I want the distance here to be 7/8. And I want this measurement here to be a 1/2 inch. So if we examine our shape here, we still have a couple of things that are not defined. And we can try to figure out what those are by clicking on the things that are blue and moving them. So we forgot to add the measurement for the overall height of this shape. So I'm going to use my dimension tool again, which again, you can use the D key as a hotkey to do that quickly. So I'm going to set the distance from here to here. Let's make this an 1.5 inch bracket. Okay. So we're very nearly done. By the way, you may have noticed a little blue point up here. This is the end point of our construction line. It is not critical that we define that end point. This line is a reference. The line itself is white, which means that it's fully constrained. Because I'm using dark mode, fully constrained instead of being black is white. But it doesn't matter. So you can leave that as fully blue there. You can leave the end point down here as blue. But we do need to deal with this line. So let's come in here and take a look at it and see. I can't drag it that way. So we're still missing a dimension here. Let's see if it allows us to. Yep. So if we just dimension it in terms of its length in this direction, that solves our problem. So let's try to give this a realistic dimension. Let's go with 3/8 here. That's pretty close to where we were. Okay, so if I was to fully extrude this, I would have a fully dimensioned, fully constrained object. And if I click on all my constraints, you'll see that we now have a whole mess of constraints, right? I'm going to uncheck that box. I'm actually going to do one last thing before we extrude this thing. I really like this circle being here, but I need one on the other side. So in my menu, I'm going to select the mirror tool. I'm going to use my construction line again, and I'm going to mirror that circle over to the other side. So again, I'm using the mirror tool. When you use the mirror tool, you'll get an info box that will tell you to select a mirror line. Click on your construction line, and then click on your circle. So now I can finish my sketch. I can still see my construction lines because my sketch is still visible. But now I'm going to go ahead and extrude this shape. And let's give it an extrude depth of 1/8 of an inch. This is a metal bracket after all. I'll hide my planes and my origin. And there is our fully constructed metal bracket. Let's go ahead and change its appearance, which you can do over here in the part menu. I'm going to right click on my part, click on edit appearance. Let's make this thing look metallic. So we'll give it kind of that color there. I'm also going to assign a material to this. Let's make this bracket out of aluminum. So let's just put generic aluminum. So now if I really wanted to get some technical information about this, I could come down here into my menu, which is underneath my recording window. 1 second. There it is. I can come into my material properties menu here, and it will tell me everything that I need to know about the geometry of the shape, its volume, how much it will weigh, because now it's made out of aluminum. So you can see this is a really lightweight part. It's only 0.02 of a pound. Okay, let's go ahead and rename this part while we're thinking about it. So we'll call this example angle bracket. Okay, so hopefully this gave you some tools that you can use and apply as we continue to dive further into Onshape. Please make sure that you create this object in your own Onshape document and submit it by the end of class. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll see you in the next one.